We Europeans are 750 million people, spread across more than 50 states. Our shared continent has a dreadful recent history of hate-filled conflict in which millions died, of political borders drawn and redrawn, of clashes between old and new ideologies. It's a continent in rapid transition, but to where? And while there are many signs of hope, there are also many worrying signs of division. This is the story of a man who 1400 years ago brought fresh, radical thinking to a Europe that was in crisis. His ideas saved Europe then. They are needed again today. That man was an outsider who came from what was seen as a primitive and backward land. His name was Columbanus. Columbanus arrived in a Europe that was bitterly divided by religious differences. It was also violently divided by tribal allegiances. People's lives were made considerably worse by very poor leadership in both church and state. In the midst of this chaos, Columbanus offered hope. He and his disciples built monasteries that became beacons of Western learning and civilization throughout the Dark Ages. Columbanus also risked his life when he demanded much higher standards of leadership from very powerful kings, from bishops, and even from popes. And he brought a big idea of unity that offered a solution to division. It's an idea of pulling together in partnership, still capable of inspiring today's secular continent as it struggles to accommodate the diversity of its people. And so I'm following in the footsteps of Columbanus, tracing a journey into a world in crisis nearly 1400 years ago, seeking answers for the often fractured Europe of today. The Roman Empire. From the 1st to the 5th century, that empire brought an advanced civilization to a massive landmass that stretched from the sands of North Africa to the ramparts of Hadrian's Wall. The territories of this powerful empire benefited from its engineering, its law and order, and the sophisticated learning of Greek and Roman civilization. Columbanus brought a lot to Europe, yet interestingly, he was a rank outsider. He came from the only country in Western Europe to stay outside of the Roman Empire. Yet his achievements took place against the backdrop of its rise and fall. Ireland lay on the edge of Europe, beyond the Roman Empire. An island without books, roads and towns. An island so remote and so apart that Columbanus and his fellow Irish were viewed as mere barbarians. But by the time Columbanus was born in the 6th century, Europe was in a state of flux. Columbanus' life played out in a Europe plunged into violent chaos by the collapse of the Roman Empire following attacks by barbarian tribes. In this Europe of the Dark Ages, his vision, talents and faith had a unique impact. While Roman civilization collapsed, so-called uncivilized Ireland was undergoing a radical social and cultural revolution. It was the fruits of this Irish revolution that Columbanus would bring to Europe. We're told that Columbanus was a popular and attractive young man, born in the centre of Ireland in Leinster, probably to a wealthy landowning family, around the year 550. Columbanus was the first Irishman to leave a body of written work. He was also the first to have a biography written about him shortly after his death. However, we should read that book with care because it conveys Columbanus as a very saintly hero. You know, I really am tired of these old-fashioned traditional lives of the saints. They're so syrupy and full of gross exaggerations. There was a real Columbanus, and we need to find the real Columbanus. He was born into an Iron Age world. Ancient traditions practiced for centuries were a part of daily life, some primitive and brutal. Recent archaeological evidence reveals that children were ritually sacrificed. But the old ways were changing. This ancient well in County Tyrone was once sacred to the Druids. They saw their religion in the landscape around them, their gods in the trees, fire and water. Around the time of Columbanus, such old pagan traditions were being adopted by Christians, and places like this well also became sacred to them. Archaeologist Edel Brannock believes this adoption of Christianity illustrates that the remote island of Hibernia wasn't nearly as isolated as some people might think.
When we think of Columbanus and of his background, in Ireland is a period of a huge explosion of change. We are in touch with the Roman Empire, we're trading, and especially I go back to Leinster and where he's coming from, down the east coast of Ireland. More and more we, for example, are finding Mediterranean and Gaulish pottery. We also are finding how Christianity may have trickled in with things like the shrines or the relics of saints are obviously being brought in by many people who are Christian. Ireland is getting all sorts of new ideas, and of course the great idea was Christianity.
These finds show that Ireland was not isolated, but was trading with the rest of Europe, and with that contact came ideas. Columbanus was born into an Ireland that was absorbing a variety of new outside influences. Tell me about Columbanus's people's faith. What was their faith?
The likelihood is that his parents would have been Christian. His grandparents perhaps not. They could have been far more attached to the earlier belief system. So Columbanus is not awakening as a child into just, I suspect, one particular religion. He is in a society that is really in flux.
I find it just intriguing to think that Columbanus's Ireland is such an exciting place, open to the world, trading goods, services, ideas, and the biggest idea is Christianity. New ideas did not only come from Rome. Fresh finds reveal that Ireland was also trading with, and therefore open to ideas, from Africa. Christians had gone off into the wilderness of the desert and forsaken all material comforts to get closer to their new Christian God. These African desert fathers led lives of extreme self-sacrifice, aiming to purify not only themselves, but their religion and their society. And their example inspired young Irish men and women. Ireland did not have deserts, but it did have wilderness. Early Irish Christians sought out remote islands, cliffs and mountainsides, where they lived simple lives of personal sacrifice and prayer. These Christians came together in monastic communities. More and more of these communities were appearing throughout Ireland. One of the most famous was Bangor Abbey. And it was to here in Bangor that the young Columbanus decided to come, to join this new life of sacrifice and faith and become a monk. You know, I'm wondering why a handsome, attractive young nobleman who could have had an easy life would turn his back on his family and make his future in a monastery. I've come to the church built on the site of Bangor Abbey to discover what exactly Columbanus would have experienced when he first came here. The abbey was only a few years old when Columbanus arrived, but it had already gained a reputation for a tough daily regime.
It's a harsh regime. They're coming from a military background, except instead of fighting other people, what they're doing is they're fighting their own bodies and their own temptations. You live separately in individual huts, but you gather together in the church every 3 hours. You don't sleep at night. You're standing guard, and your job is to pray. They'd fast a lot. They push themselves to offer themselves up for gods. One of the ways in which they push themselves is they would go into the lake, and they could be standing in the lake, maybe in cross vigil with their arms up, and they could be reciting 100 Our Fathers like that. The rules are very strict about total obedience to the abbot. You don't backchat, you don't gossip, you don't ever question what he says. He is the guy in charge. So they created a tight-knit community, partly by the harshness and the rigor of the regime.
That regime, which he aspired to be part of, that seems to be very, very harsh and difficult, why would anybody undertake such a life voluntarily?
I mean, we say harshness in a negative sense, but people admired that. And there are people who want to be the very best and who will push themselves to the ultimate extreme in order to be the best.
I really do have to admire the fact that Columbanus chose to come to Bangor, to this monastery, because it had the reputation of offering the harshest form of monastic life. That tells us a lot about the character of the man. Columbanus's Bangor Abbey was a place where young men sought to purify the world through purifying themselves. But it also became one of the first urban centres in Ireland. The surviving ruins of Glendalough give us a better understanding of what foundations like Bangor Abbey must have been like. As well as the church, the monks had a refectory where they gathered to eat food produced in the surrounding fields or fished in the loch. More importantly, perhaps, for Columbanus, there was also a scriptorium where books were made, as well as a library and a school. In these places, a depth of scholarship developed, which, through Columbanus, would come to have a major impact on so-called Dark Age Europe.
Before his time, we mustn't imagine that Irish culture was ignorant. But what arrived with Christianity wasn't just the knowledge of the three sacred languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, but the whole array of Mediterranean Christian culture that came with it.
So Ireland has absorbed and is absorbing this wave of ideas. What does it do with them? Does it do much with them?
Oh, it does. It does everything with them. The first thing the Irish made themselves masters of was grammar. And they created a whole library of new Latin grammars. And the second thing they did was to make themselves the best mathematicians in Europe. And the Irish very quickly become the masters of this in the whole of Western Europe.
You've described to us how Ireland absorbed so much that was rich from Europe. What did they do with that? Did they return the compliment? Did they do anything with it?
They invented new forms of script. In ancient Hebrew and Greek and Latin, the writing was continuous, scriptura continua. But the Irish broke these up by putting spaces between words. Most that you and I take for granted on a modern printed page is an invention of the Irish in the 6th and 7th centuries.
Tell me then, when Columbanus, in his 40s, decides to head to Europe on a missionary endeavour, what's in his thinking?
Well, he knows things that they don't. He's got the zeal that the Irish have. I mean, the Western Empire is running down and has run down. There are no more Roman emperors in the West. It's only barbarian kings. And the Irish come with no army, with no economic power, only intellectual acumen. The only thing they have is persuasiveness. They are the masters of argument, and they are the exhibitors of a peculiarly rigorous religious life.
The Ireland Columbanus was leaving behind had, through a mixture of trade, travel and the religious culture of the monasteries, been transformed. No longer a remote wind-swept backwater, it was, by the end of the 6th century, a rich culture, buzzing with ideas, the biggest of which was Christianity. The image I have is of an Ireland alive with learning, and Columbanus armed with great scholarship, intense spirituality, wanting to spread this big idea through the power of persuasion and his own personal holiness. Columbanus travelled to Europe with a spiritual and a political vision that would challenge the most powerful leaders of the continent. A vision still relevant in today's pluralist and secular Europe. Columbanus, now in his 40s, set sail from Bangor, leaving behind once again everything familiar, everything he's ever known. Heads towards a chaotic Europe, to a life, well, who knows what it's going to hold for him. Columbanus and the small group of disciples who travelled with him may well have landed at Cornwall first, where a church dedicated to him still exists. They continued on to France and a Europe which he would enrich by bringing scholarship and spirituality from Ireland, where he would risk his life challenging those in power. I have come to France to follow in the footsteps of Columbanus. When he arrived here in the 7th century, the continent was controlled by warring tribes. Columbanus is a complete stranger in a foreign land. No one here has ever heard of Columbanus. But he has a mission and he has a vision. And the big question is, where is he going to start? From Brittany, Columbanus made his way to Annegray in eastern France, where he built his first monastery. Today, French and Irish archaeologists are undertaking a major survey of the site. As they dig, clues are emerging that answer questions about Columbanus. Why did he choose to build here, and how did a so-called barbarian manage to get this site in the first place?
We know just he met the king of Burgundy, Sigisbert, and Sigisbert gave him this area, this space. it was probably a holy area.
A holy place, a sacred place.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we found, you can see on this map, we found the plan of a temple, a Roman temple, just 20 meters from here.
So, a king gives a complete stranger from Ireland called Columbanus what you are telling me is a very important Roman site.
It was an important Roman site. But Columbanus was an important person. And Columbanus was like, how to say, le représentant.
The representative.
The representative of the king.
Columbanus clearly impressed the King of Gall. Evidence from the dig suggests that Columbanus shrewdly convinced the king to build a monastery as a way of defining his territory. This stranger from Ireland was obviously an astute reader of men. He negotiated fearlessly at the highest level. He navigated a complex political landscape, and he took an ancient pagan site and made it a new, sacred Christian place. We know that Columbanus was a spiritual genius, but now we're finding out that he was also something of a political genius. So great was the demand to join the way of life that Columbanus had brought from Ireland that within a few years he returned to the king and negotiated a second monastery site in nearby Luxeuil. Today it's a thriving town built on a remarkable history.
Yes.
Sebastian and his team are slowly uncovering that history, digging deep into the past at the site of Columbanus' second monastery. They believe there was already a small, though weakened, community of Christians here who had survived the barbarian invasions.
The city of Luxeuil was an antique city, and in the middle of the 4th century, there was some barbarian invasion. And reimagine until now, the city was totally destroyed. But in fact, it wasn't. And when Columbanus arrived in this city, he discovered a Christian community. Because in this place, we are in a Christian church of the 5th century.
Before Columbanus?
Before Columbanus. There was a Christian people 1 century and a half before Columbanus, yes.
When Columbanus arrived, Luxeuil was a city in decline, and Christianity in the region was also in decline. So what did he bring? What did Columbanus bring to that situation?
Columbanus impulsed a new spiritual energy. He invented a new form of monastic way of life. So a monastic way of life who came from Ireland.
It was a way of life that quickly captured hearts and minds. Soon Columbanus opened a third monastery at Fontainebleau. This place is such an impressive sight. It's a very special place where you feel deeply in the presence of Columbanus and in his world as it was at that time. Here among these ruins, I really am getting a sense of the sheer scale of the challenge facing Columbanus to revitalise this people, this church in decline. The monastery that Columbanus founded at Luxeuil would grow into one of the most important monastic centres of the early Middle Ages. Over time, Luxeuil became the hub of a network of over 50 monasteries throughout the continent.
Voilà.
So here we
So
are
now,
at the Abbaye Saint-Colomban.
nous arrivons avec le même panneau qu'à Bangor.
Oh yes, of course. Sebastian has brought me to the monastic buildings.
Non,
The interior
là, dans
of
la
the
ville
abbey.
de Luxeuil.
The popularity and success of Columbanus' way of life was due to more than his enthusiastic spirituality of sacrifice. There was something else which he also brought from Ireland.
Luxeuil became a very famous abbey because when Columbanus and the first monks came, they bring with them
Scholarship, is
the
it from
scholarship from Ireland. So in Luxeuil, it was like in the monastery in Ireland, with a very important artistic and intellectual life. As soon as they founded the monastery, the elite was sent in this monastery for their education.
And why was that? What attracted wealthy parents to send their children here?
Because the monks was have a very good education.
The sons of the European elite became the monk students, and these students became the abbots, bishops and kings of Europe. In an age before the printing press, when the only way to preserve books was to copy them, the monastery's scriptorium created lavishly illuminated manuscripts that became celebrated far beyond Gall. I can see why Columbanus stood out, a wild-haired Irish scholar, passionate about faith, learning and a new spiritual life. But crucially, he also offered sinners new hope. One tradition that Columbanus brought from Ireland had a revolutionary impact. He taught that people could receive forgiveness from sin time and time again. They need only confess to a spiritual advisor, their unum cara. This was radically different from the Roman tradition of public penance, the sinner clad in sackcloth and ashes, and the belief that sins could only be washed away once. For ordinary sinners like me, it was a doctrine of hope.
Before Columbanus, in the first centuries of Christianity, the forgiveness of God was given only once in the life. So generally speaking, people were waiting the end of life to ask the forgiveness of God. And sometimes they were waiting too long, and it was not possible. But for the Irish monks and for Columbanus, the idea was every day we have to ask the forgiveness to God. And this is a new idea that the Irish monks introduced into the Catholic Church.
So he's saying you don't have to wait until the end of your life. You can have forgiveness every day.
Exactly, yes. It's a new idea that forgiveness of God is possible if they are sincere.
This sounds to me like a very different idea of God from the harsh, judgmental God to the gentle, loving, forgiving Father.
Yes, this is the idea of a God of love.
This new idea of God's forgiveness became so popular in France that Columbanus wrote a guidebook called a penitential. It advised what penances an unum cara should assign for specific sins. This innovation became so successful that it eventually was adopted by the wider Christian Church as the sacrament of confession. Columbanus brought other Irish practices and customs that would have been strange to the French, including a different date for celebrating the major Christian festival of Easter.
Bonne journée. Merci.
Bonjour. Bonjour. Oh, merci, monsieur. Merci beaucoup. When Columbanus and his monks arrived here in France to make their lives, they looked strange. They had very strange ideas and strange customs. And yet, remarkably, the local people, the ordinary people, really welcomed them and were open to them. And because they were open, they benefited hugely. Columbanus' monastic way of life reinvigorated Christianity. His learning underpinned a sophisticated scholarship that informed generations of European leaders. The practice of the unum cara introduced a revolutionary concept of forgiveness that transformed people's lives. Little wonder, then, that Columbanus is still honoured in this area, particularly here in these woods, where he spent time alone in the wilderness, maintaining another Irish custom, that of making a retreat, of finding God in the natural world around him. Columbanus came to this very beautiful spot twice a year to prepare for Easter, to prepare for Christmas, to take himself away from the monastery and just to be on retreat. And it's interesting that so many people, 1400 years later, are still coming here to this spot, writing in these books as if they could almost encounter him here, physically as well as spiritually. There is no doubt that Columbanus made a big impact in Gall, but he also made enemies by going against the grain of the established church hierarchy. Columbanus seems to have been very well received generally, but then he had problems with the bishops. What was it about Columbanus that these bishops didn't like?
Columbanus founded 3 monasteries in this area without any permission from bishops. He asked nothing to the bishop of this area, only from the king.
Columbanus annoyed the bishops, not only with his practice of foreign customs. On the continent, bishops expected abbots like Columbanus to obey them. But in Irish custom, an abbot was of equal rank to a bishop. Not only did Columbanus see himself as equal, his faith and life were built on a rejection of worldly values. So when he saw how well some princes of the church were living, he was not impressed.
Some bishops were very earnest, and they were really bishops. Some of them were people from the high society, coming from families very wealthy, and they had chosen the way of the church for political reasons. So they were living in towns, sometimes with mistresses, and they had nothing to do with gospel. And Columbanus could not admit such a way of life for a Christian.
The bishops summoned Columbanus to account for his foreign customs. He wrote to them, criticising their comfortable lifestyles and asking them to tolerate his different Irish ways. He advocated unity, writing, "We are all joint members of one body, whether Franks, Britons or Irish, or whatever people we come from." In Columbanus's world, people squabble incessantly over differences. But in these letters, Columbanus sets out a radical new vision in which he challenges people to focus on what unites them, what they share, rather than what divides them. The letter is fascinating. It may be one of the first written expressions of an international, shared sense of identity, which crosses boundaries of nationality and race. "13 centuries later, in the aftermath of World War II, Columbanus' call for unity between peoples was heard again. With the devastation, hatred and division of war still lingering in the air, European leaders gathered in Luxeuil in July 1950 to mark the 1400th anniversary of the birth of Columbanus, and a new idea was born. On the fringes of that gathering, it is said a secret meeting at this house in Luxeuil was attended by politicians from across Europe, including members of the then Irish government, Sean MacBride and Taoiseach John A. Costello. The idea of a Europe united in diversity may very well have started here in this house in the name of Columbanus. Because at that secret meeting, it is said that the seeds were sown for what became the European Union. During the anniversary celebrations, Robert Schuman, one of the founders of the European Union, said, "St. Columbanus willed and achieved a spiritual union between the principal European countries of his time." And he referred to Columbanus as the patron saint of all those who now seek to build a united Europe. Back in the 7th century Luxeuil, things started to go badly wrong for Columbanus. Although he worked with powerful leaders to achieve his aims, Columbanus was not willing to compromise his principles for them. When asked to condone the king's keeping of mistresses, he refused. It was a dangerous and brave act by Columbanus. The king had already killed a bishop who criticised his private life. In response, the king seizes Columbanus and the other Irish monks from their monastery and marches them 800 miles to the port of Nantes to be shipped back to Ireland. From his cell in Nantes, Columbanus writes a moving farewell letter to his monks back in Luxeuil. Columbanus is at his lowest ebb. He feels a complete and abject failure, and yet he's able to write to his fellow monks and tell them to love and to forgive. His community of monks is now made up of many different nationalities, and in his letter to them, Columbanus again stresses the power of unity and also forgiveness. He urges them to forgive the king who seized him. That's a message which, it seems to me, is as relevant in today's angry 21st century as it was in the time of Columbanus. Then Columbanus' luck improves. There is a storm in Nantes, and the boat transporting him and the other monks back to Ireland is unable to leave port. The captain, believing this is a sign from God, releases the monks, and so they are free men again. Free, but not free to return to Gall. So Columbanus and his Irish monks set out on yet another journey, an epic trek across Europe and along the banks of the Rhine to Brigantium. Now called Bregenz, it was here, on the shores of Lake Constance, that Columbanus founded his 4th monastery, once again after negotiations with the local king. Statues mark his legacy today, but in the 7th century, Columbanus, his disciples and their Christianity were rejected by the people of Brigantium, a rejection that would end in violence. When 2 of his monks were brutally murdered, Columbanus felt he had no choice but to leave. Expelled from Gall, rejected by Brigantium, cast adrift from the monasteries he had trekked far across Europe to build, At this point, Columbanus must have wondered if his life's mission had come to nothing. And yet he did not give up. He was a man of great inner strength, a strength that is revealed in his writing. You spent a lot of your career studying and translating Columbanus. How does he, the person, come across to you in terms of character?
I think extremely driven, and what impresses me about Columbanus is really his energy, and the energy comes across very strongly in his writings.
And by this stage, Columbanus is a good age.
Yeah, he's probably in his early 60s. And he's trudged across most of Western Europe by this stage.
Tell me about his spirituality.
Well, there's something mystical about about some of his writings, the sense that reason alone cannot comprehend God, but also the idea that we are pilgrims on the earth, that we don't really have a home anywhere on earth, and so our life is a journey. And we see this right throughout his kind of religious odyssey on the continent, where he's continually being compelled forward. And Rome and Italy had a very big attraction, and so he talks a lot about Rome in his letters, and not as the seat of empire, but as the Church of St. Peter and Paul. And so he's attracted to Italy.
Behind me are the Alps, and beyond them, Italy. And this wall of mountains, Columbanus has to climb to get to Italy if he's to start all over again. While Columbanus headed for Italy, one of his disciples, who had followed him all the way from Ireland, chose to stay on the shores of Lake Constance and build a hermitage in the wilderness. That disciple's name was Gall, and his hermitage became the monastic town of St. Gallen in Switzerland, which grew into another major centre of spirituality and scholarship in Europe. In this modern Swiss town, you get a real sense of the impact of those monastic foundations laid down by Columbanus and his disciples, perhaps better than anywhere else in Europe. St. Gallen is a special place because not only are the abbey buildings still standing, but the library also survives. I think the only way to greet this place for the first time, is any time perhaps, is just with complete awe. We've moved literally through centuries here, centuries of thinking, centuries of writing that have influenced our world in Europe and right around the world. Quite a wonderful feeling to be in the place where a small group of Irish monks with great intellects and a great scholarly discipline who leave their country, who come here with very little except what they have, brain power they have. And out of that, they create a tradition of learning, of scholarship, of questioning, a tradition of a real formidable intellectual endeavour that continues in this library to this day and is part of Europe's patrimony, is part of the world's intellectual patrimony. This library remains a majestic monument to how the treasures of European civilization were preserved by Columbanus and other Irish monks.
Oh, they played a crucial role throughout Europe, I could say, because before Columbanus arrived on the continent, barbarian tribes like the Vandals had gone through Europe, and they had pretty much destroyed all the civilization of the Roman Empire. But when the Irish monks arrived, they brought classical learning with them, and they valued classical scholarship very highly, and their standard of Latin was very high as well. So you could say that the Irish helped save the Roman culture for us, and they brought back Christianity to the continent.
And in this library, over 1,000 years later, you can still find evidence of the monks who came from Ireland, with the artistry and literacy skills to make books in a time before printing presses, when, without the copying of books by hand, no knowledge would be passed on.
St. Gall has still got the largest collection of Irish manuscripts on the continent, and sometimes in these manuscripts you find notes in the margins written by the scribes themselves, and they are complaining about the arduous task of writing or composing little poems as well as commenting on the text.
Isn't that just typically Irish, complaining and composing poetry? The exquisite artistry and delicate craft of the Irish scribes is alive on the pages of the St. Gallen manuscripts. Each one painstakingly constructed from animal skin, the inks skillfully extracted from minerals and plants. This beautiful old 9th century Latin grammar is written in Irish. It was probably written in Ireland, and it was brought then here to St. Gallen, and of course is a jewel in the crown of the collection here. But it's very interesting. Besides the meticulously written Latin grammar text, those who were writing the text took the opportunity to add their own comments from time to time. On this page, at the top, someone has written in Ogham script, "I had too much beer last night, now I have a headache." And at the bottom, someone has written in Irish a very beautiful poem about his love of nature and how he would love to be outdoors. In the majesty of the buildings here in St. Gallen, we can see how people on the European mainland benefited by being open to people they had previously seen as barbarian, as less than human. Columbanus and his disciples left a legacy of monastic foundations that saved and transmitted the knowledge not only of Christianity, but of Greek and Roman classics, which these monks copied and preserved. Before Columbanus, the Irish were seen as uncivilized from the edge of the world. It is with him that the legend of Ireland as a holy island, as the land of saints and scholars, begins. While Gall was left behind in St. Gallen, Columbanus, by then in his 60s, set off on an arduous journey over the Alps into what is now northern Italy. It was the kingdom of another barbarian tribe, the Lombards. He went to the king of Milan and negotiated land on the site of an abandoned church in Bobbio. It would be his fifth and final foundation. When Columbanus arrived here, he began labouring and chopping down trees to build a monastery. That monastery, like Luxeuil and Gallen, would become a major centre, not only of spirituality, but of culture. And as with his other foundations, contacts between Bobbio and Ireland continued for centuries after Columbanus, with Irish monks following in his footsteps, bringing books and working in the scriptorium. But Columbanus wasn't content to build just a new monastery. He also wanted to build a more united Europe. That required good leadership, and he wasn't afraid to take on the most powerful leader of all, the Pope. Columbanus had noticed that the European continent was split, not only by tribal and regional divisions, but also by religion. He felt that the situation was made worse by poor leadership of various popes. Columbanus wrote a blistering letter to the Pope in which he told him to wake up, do his job properly, and heal the divisions in Europe caused by his predecessors. Columbanus made clear how he felt the Pope could become a better and purer leader. Tell me about this letter that Columbanus wrote from here to the Pope. What makes Columbanus think he has the right to speak like this to a Pope?
Columbanus believes that if you have a leader who is more concerned about material things, about wealth, about status, about prestige, either personal prestige or institutional wealth, status and prestige, that leader is courting disaster, because that leader will take his eye off the ball. He won't lead his people, he will be more interested in wealth and power and prestige. What Columbanus calls on the Bishop of Rome to do is to keep his eye on what really matters, which is about unity, about spiritual leadership, to turn away from earthly concerns. Then and only then can he give heroic, true leadership.
Columbanus had very clear views about what made for good leadership. A good leader was principled, prepared to sacrifice. A person who gave service, was not interested in self-service. With that kind of leadership, you could build trust, you could build hope, you could lead people to a better place. According to tradition, Columbanus's own journey through life ended at the cave he used as a retreat here in Bobbio 1400 years ago on the 23rd of November 615. This beautiful tomb is the final resting place of Columbanus. It's a very respectful and lovely memorial to a remarkable man, but it's not the legacy or the memorial that Columbanus would have wished. What he wished for is that the seeds of his thinking would gather momentum through the generations, transforming how we relate to each other. Columbanus was buried here in the crypt of the monastery he founded, now the Basilica in Bobbio. 1400 years later, these buildings are no longer part of the monastery. They are, however, used as a school for the young people of Bobbio. Do you think Columbanus' ideas, sue idee, sui pensieri, sono più importanti adesso che nel passato?
Yes.
You are all young Europeans. When you become a mother or a father, will you teach your children about Columbanus? Will you tell them about Columbanus?
Yes.
Let's take 5 words that are about Columbanus. Tutti insieme. Rispetto, respect. Honesty. Love. Peace. Faith. Courage. I suppose it's no surprise that the children here are fascinated by the history of Columbanus. But what I find striking is how important he is to them, what an inspiration he is to them today. I can't imagine that Irish school children would be able to talk about this remarkable Irish saint with the same level of knowledge and passion. That's a great pity, and a sign that there is important work to be done, to re-establish Columbanus's legacy in his native land. "1,400 years after his death, the wild-haired Irish monk, with his radical ideas, spirituality, scholarship, and fearlessness, continues to inspire. But where did his inspiration come from?" I think I'm still searching for the key to Columbanus. What would you say that key is?
It's actually very simple. His principles are about harmony in diversity, and his ideas go back way beyond Christianity. People in the ancient world saw tremendous variety and tremendous diversity in the world about them. And Columbanus takes over these ideas and he talks about the diversity among human communities, among peoples, among nations. But if they work together in peace and in harmony, it makes life possible for everybody.
He uses an image of a choir, doesn't he?
Yeah, the image of the choir was popular in political rhetoric of the ancient world. Different people singing different notes in polyphony. You've people with different registers, people with different abilities. But the result is a harmonious sound.
A choir is a very powerful image for conveying Columbanus's philosophy of harmony in diversity. In Columbanus's view, sameness and monotony were boring and banal, and diversity was to be celebrated. The variety of different voices makes the whole stronger. Columbanus never made it to Rome, but his ideas certainly did, and they still offer solutions in today's fragile Europe. Although modern technology and globalization are bringing us closer together, we remain fearful of difference, of religion, nationality, culture, even of sexuality. Columbanus' story suggests that we should embrace and learn from these differences and recognize the common humanity that unites us. Being open to the other benefits us as individuals and as a society. What Columbanus is telling us is that the peoples of this very, very diverse Europe have nothing to lose and everything to gain by working well together. By learning from Columbanus, our first European, through harnessing our national and European identities and pulling together, it seems to me the problems of Europe can be solved. There is a line in Micheál O'Shea's poem Wound, which speaks of a fabric stitched and toughened in its darn. That's Columbanus's Europe, a patchwork quilt of different peoples and histories painstakingly stitched together, and all the stronger for the stitching.